a few folk in the waiting room. Okay, so just to kick us off today, we will have Jose. And Jose is a literature graduate from Glasgow Uni, currently working towards opening a shop for her textile illustrations. She also runs a rather nifty book review account on Instagram called Book Jungle. Recommend checking that out. So Jose is going to kick us off today by sharing 5 things about Breathe by James Nestor. Jose.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Andy, for having me. It's really nice to be here. I hope you're all having a really nice start to your week so far and a lovely start to your morning. I always look forward to these. I'll be talking about Breath, the New Science of a Lost Art by James Nestor, which came out in May of last year. It's essentially a book about the history and science of how our breathing really affects our bodies. So how our breathing has kind of gotten worse over time and how we can practice better kind of breathing techniques and create better subconscious breathing habits. Despite breathing being our most kind of essential function, it's what gives us life. Apparently, most of us don't breathe the way we should be anymore. And in doing so, we're kind of aggravating a whole lot of incredibly common like chronic health conditions like sleep apnea or stress or asthma, for example. James Nestor is a sports and science journalist, and this is his 3rd popular science book. And he talks about his motivation for writing the book being that Western medicine these days doesn't really acknowledge the importance that breathing has on our overall health at all, really. So it's not something that we kind of regularly think about, but he wants to change that. And he does so by suggesting a lot of breathing techniques based in like a lot of history and the science that can help us. So I learned so much from this book, particularly kind of more on that technical side, because this is the side of things that I really don't know anything about. I didn't have any idea the extent of exactly what was happening in my body when I'm breathing and how I'm breathing. But I'm not a scientist. I've never been very good at science. It's always intimidated me a little bit, but he explains everything in a really lovely, accessible and really personal way as well. So yeah, I learned an awful lot. Also think it was a pretty good time for me to have read this book, with everything that's happened kind of in the past year, and now that kind of lockdown is easing and places are opening back up and there's like more crowds, and I know for me this last year, and I think a lot of people will agree, I'm sure, has been like there's quite a lot of stress and anxiety surrounding everything. So there's been lots out of our control, obviously, but this book's been a really good reminder to kind of step back and look at what I kind of can control and remember how I'm breathing and how that can kind of help in small ways. So my first takeaway from it is humans have become the worst breathers in the animal kingdom. So there are so many notable differences between the way that humans breathe to the way other animals breathe. And we're actually the only mammal on Earth prone to chronic respiratory issues. And it's because like why we've kind of become worse and worse breathers starts with kind of a key period in our evolution and is now being perpetuated by the kind of unpresent, very like fast-paced, high-stress way that we live our lives. So some 300,000 years ago, early versions of humans kind of had very wide mouths and wide nasal cavities and very open airways, very similar facial structures to what we now see still in like apes. But when we began to kind of cook with fire and develop language, this completely changed and our mouths shrunk and our airways became a lot more kind of tight and constricted. Also something that happened was our larynx, which is the point of our throat responsible for not just talking, but also breathing and swallowing, shifted down when we developed speech. So we could communicate, but it became harder to breathe because we became the only mammals who couldn't swallow and breathe at the same time. And we're now the only species susceptible to choking, which we even do on our own breath, which is essentially what's happening when we snore a lot. So kind of even though like our evolutionary changes that allowed us to communicate and things kind of initially set us apart from other animals, they've actually put us at a greater disadvantage long term in terms of our breathing. And a big part of this takeaway for me was that this is something that's kind of still happening to a degree, as we're now passing down worse and worse subconscious breathing habits by not even thinking about it. We don't have the kind of ease of airflow that other animals with these less constricted airways have anymore. So although we can't change this stage of our evolution, we now need to pay more attention to the way we're breathing so we're not kind of making things worse and worse. So my second takeaway from it was breathe through your nose. And this is one of the biggest points he makes throughout the whole book, is just how much difference mouth breathing can make to your whole body. As if you're breathing too much through your mouth over a long period of time, it can completely transform your whole body and your airways, all for the worse, basically. He puts himself through a number of breathing experiments throughout his research for the book. But one of the biggest ones he talks about is he and a colleague block off their nasal airways for 10 days and track the effects that just mouth breathing has on their bodies. And after the 10-day period, they have completely spiked blood pressure and stress hormones. Their heart rate variability has gotten much worse, and their overall mental clarity and mental health is severely decreased. And they feel pretty awful, to be honest. And they actually repeat it by just breathing through their noses for 10 days and tracking the same things afterwards. And all their symptoms completely go away. And they also notice that the longer they breathe through their noses, the kind of less congested they become and the easier it becomes to do that. Things like hay fever and congestion and sinus issues are so common these days. And when we're kind of stuffed up, we feel like it's impossible to breathe through our noses and we end up breathing through our mouths. And over half the population are apparently now chronic mouth breathers. So it's actually perpetuating itself, because the more we breathe through our mouths, the more our body adjusts and the more prone we become to doing it subconsciously, and the worse effect it's having on our bodies long term. So it's really important to kind of make ourselves breathe through our noses as much as we possibly can. And the longer we do it, the easier it'll get. My third takeaway is slower, deeper breaths can decrease stress and increase our lifespan. So this maybe seems obvious, as we're told a lot to take kind of slow breaths when we're really stressed. But lots of us are probably actually putting our bodies under way too much unneeded long-term stress by breathing too fast without even realizing we're doing it. And when we breathe fast and shallow, we're only really penetrating the nerves at the top of our lungs, which are part of the sympathetic nervous system, which is basically what kind of triggers speeding up your heart rate, your digestion, and your blood pressure. And it's what activates your fight or flight response and kind of puts your body into action. And when you breathe slow and deeper, you penetrate the nerves deeper down in your lungs that are part of your parasympathetic nervous system, which does the opposite and slows everything down and creates like a deeper feeling of relaxation. So breathing fast can be a good thing when you're trying to get pumped up for exercising or something like that, but it's not something we should be doing when we're resting. But since we're doing this so subconsciously all the time, we end up in this horrible kind of vicious cycle of suspended stress where our mental stress is impacting our breathing, and then our breathing impacts our physical stress, which then impacts our breathing more, which then impacts our mental stress, and round and round and round. And this is something I know I definitely notice in myself quite a lot, and particularly have noticed these past couple of weeks. I've just gone back to work. I quite like being busy, and I think sometimes kind of thrive on stress. It makes me feel like I'm being more productive, and I think probably quite a lot of people do the same thing, because I think we kind of use stress often to feel more productive or achieve goals or get things done, but it doesn't actually feel very great for me anyway, in my body, and over a long period of time, it's not really doing us any good. If we look at the animal kingdom again, the mammals who breathe the slowest also have the lowest resting heart rate and tend to have the longest kind of proportional lifespans. like tortoises, for example, who only breathe around 4 times per minute compared to the average 15 to 18 for humans. And they live up to like 150, 200 years. So maybe if we breathe slower, we can live as long as tortoises. Who knows? My fourth takeaway is breathing less can give us more. So James Nestor talks about how kind of what we really want to be doing is breathing most in line with our metabolic needs. But for most of us, this means taking less breaths per minute than this kind of average of 15 to 18. Because when we're breathing too much over long periods of time, it can give us an imbalance of CO2 and oxygen, meaning that we can't even metabolize as much oxygen as we're taking in. And he mentioned this really amazing fact about how almost all religious and spiritual practices in the world have developed the same rate of respiration when they recite their main chant or prayer. So it takes about 5.5 seconds to recite the prayer and then 5.5 seconds to inhale, which weirdly also works out at about 5.5 breaths a minute, 5.5 liters of air that you're taking in, and a blood CO2 level of 5.5%. And other than the fact that this is like weirdly mirrored, it's not coincidence. It's because this is kind of the peak rate for your body to work at peak efficiency. So we take in more oxygen at this rate and it increases blood flow to our brain, and our heart, circulation and nervous system are all kind of coordinating at peak efficiency. So people who practice prayer regularly or practice this breathing rate regularly generally experience the same kind of health and well-being benefits. So it's important for us to kind of learn to pay attention to when we might be breathing too much and try and consciously breathe less, and even at this peak rate if we can, as often as we can. And I actually learned a really cool trick a couple of years ago to know when you might be subconsciously hyperventilating. And it's if you find yourself yawning an awful lot in a day, and there's no real kind of sleep-related reason why you should be tired, then you might have been subconsciously hyperventilating, because yawning is your body's way of trying to get more oxygen to your brain. So there you go. And my fifth and final takeaway is there's always time to choose to breathe. So breathing is obviously something that we all do all the time, but because of that, we generally assume it's a passive action, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a choice to focus on exactly how we're breathing and how we can practice better breathing techniques for long-term benefits. And this is something we can do at any age and even for a few minutes a day, and it can still have like massive, massive effects. He tells a really lovely story about a 70-year-old woman who suffered from crippling asthma basically her whole life. And after just a couple months of doing breathing less practices, she then went on to hike a mountain, which I think is pretty amazing. So we might assume that we don't have time or don't want to take the time to just sit down and breathe. Like we might think, what's the point? But we can look at it like any form of exercise and plan it into our timetable like anything else. He makes a point of pointing out that it's not a straight up alternative to modern medicine. It can't necessarily heal certain things, or our genetics can predispose us to certain illnesses and things, but our lifestyle and our habits are one of the biggest things that impact towards preventing onsets or improving our general health. So I want to leave you with a quote from the end of the book, which I really love, which is, "We can be the pilots of our own bodies, not the passengers." So hopefully if we just choose to pay a little bit more attention to our breath and practice more of these beneficial breathing methods, we can start passing down better breathing habits and hopefully become better breathers in future. So that's me.
Thank you so much, Josie. I, like other people, are probably hyper aware as they're breathing right now.
Yeah.
Like, ironically, I think I stopped breathing because I got like, oh my God, I'm not breathing well. But anyway, massive round of applause for Josie there, and thanks so much for sharing that. Oh, yeah, great reminder to breathe well throughout today. So yeah, thanks for sharing that again. And next up, we have Dennis. If you've managed to catch your breath after that.
Yeah, I'm going to pay attention to my breathing here as we go.
Yeah, I think we should all do that. Dennis is a specialist in motion design and interactive learning, currently the creative lead at Maple Group. And Dennis is kindly going to share 5 things about We Are the Weather. Dennis.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to talk about this book today, We Are the Weather. This is by an American writer called Jonathan Safran Foer. I'm going to refer to him from here on in as JSF, just because it's a bit more, it's a bit easier to digest. And he's known best as a fiction writer. He's written a few. He's probably better known for a few novels that he's written, but he has more recently branched out into nonfiction as well. This book was released in 2019, and I think it's his most recent book. The book is about our relationship with climate crisis, what it means for humanity and what it means to take meaningful action. And it's a book that kind of slowly unfurls itself as it goes in terms of what it's about. So I'm going to sort of, in the spirit of that, I'm going to unfurl the details of the book as I go as well. So let's just get into it. And the first point I'm going to make is we are all in denial. Climate change is the greatest threat that has ever faced humanity, but we fail to engage because we can't see it. Compared to an exciting threat like a global pandemic, for example, it's just a little bit boring. And he has a good quote about this in the book, which is in 2018, despite knowing more than we've ever known about human-caused climate change, humans have produced more greenhouse gases than we've ever produced. So all in all, it's a real denial on quite a massive scale. And he compares this denial to the Holocaust, when many people around the world tried to sound the alarm about what was going on in Europe, but nothing was done until it was too late. And he tells a really interesting story about a young Polish Catholic who was sent to the US to break news of how the Jews were being treated in Europe. And he went on this long voyage across the world and managed to get an audience at the Supreme Court. But even then, nobody could really bring themselves to believe what he was saying. And by the time they found out the truth, it was too late. But back to the climate, there are reasons for optimism. And that brings us to the second point, which is we have made sacrifices before. And we can do it again. In another parallel with some things that happened during wartime, JSF talks about the solidarity of the American people in World War II. So as an example of some of the things that the people in America were asked to do during the Second World War, their taxes were raised, drivers accepted a new national speed limit of 35 miles per hour to save gas, and civilians grew their own veg and ate less meat. So they were eating way less than they would in normal circumstances. And these all seem like things that you couldn't imagine people really accepting, but they did. And this solidarity was a combination of top-down leadership, definitely, but also was action from individuals. There was a grassroots element too as well. And I think what it shows us is that solving big problems requires both of these two things working together. And it also, I couldn't help thinking about what we're going through at the moment as well. And this book was written before the pandemic, but I do hope one day we can look back at our experience with COVID-19 and see this as an example of how together sacrifice and solidarity helped us to make it through. But what kind of sacrifices do we need to make? Well, point 3 is the subtitle of the book, which is Saving the Planet Begins at Breakfast. The 4 highest impact things an individual can do to tackle climate change are to avoid air travel, live car-free, have fewer children, and to eat a plant-based diet. that's and the plant-based diet is really the focus of this book. So this is what JSF reckons that we should be focusing most on from all of those things. Throughout the book, he's got loads of well-researched data and reasoning for this, but the main headline really is this figure of the emissions caused by agriculture are somewhere between 14% and 51% of all emissions, which is those two figures are massively, massively different and very highly disputed as well in the scientific community. And the reason for this is because it's really hard to pin down the exact emissions agriculture causes, because as well as CO2 emissions, there are other greenhouse gases emitted too, which are actually worse. And there's considerations like deforestation, for example, that also confound the problem. So it's a big problem, and eating meat's not great. But what happens if you can't imagine life without meat? And this is where saving the planet begins at breakfast really comes into its own. His idea for this is that we can go vegan for breakfast and lunch and eat however we want for the rest of the day. And he's got the stat in there that not eating animal products for breakfast and lunch has a smaller CO2 footprint than the average full-time vegetarian diet. So essentially, if you manage to go breakfast and lunch without animal products, you can save CO2 compared to going vegetarian, which is surprising, I thought. And the whole idea of going vegan for breakfast and lunch, I think it's really interesting. It's not something I've seen really promoted anywhere else, and it does seem like quite a palatable option for people who would maybe just not even entertain the idea of giving up animal products completely. So with that in mind, it's maybe the first indication that the writer is not really a hardline vegan, and maybe he's open to things that are a bit that he's open to other options, really. So the fourth point is taking action isn't easy. JSF has a background in fiction writing, and that's what really sets this book apart from most journalistic accounts. So, for example, halfway through the book, after going through a lot of different scientific data and reasoning, he enters this long conversation between himself and his own conscience, which suddenly feels much more literary. And he talks about how he's been a vegetarian for over 30 years, yet he still admits to having these moments of weakness. He's found himself being away from his family for long periods of time and kind of caves in and goes and eats a burger. And then he feels this overwhelming shame. It feels like maybe someone who's in recovery going on a bender against what they want to be doing. And the dialogue there, it really stood out for me and just made me very aware of my own experience. So I became vegan about 18 months ago after being vegetarian for a few years. And before that, I loved meat. I honestly couldn't ever imagine living without meat. And then I sort of paired it back to dairy and cheese. Again, I really couldn't imagine living without that. But I decided I would give it a try for a few weeks. And it turned out that staying on a vegan diet, it actually came pretty easy, to be honest. And I quite enjoyed experimenting with new foods, and also just, the way the world is going. It's much easier to find good quality, interesting plant-based food, much, much easier than it was even 10 years ago. The rub of that is that I think I definitely turned into a bit of a bore. And anyone who would listen, I would be telling them how easy it is to make the change and to become vegan. But by reading this book, it's made me more aware of the fact that my experience is not the same as everybody's experience. Giving up meat and dairy, it's not easy for everyone. We've all got different contexts, motivations. Everybody's just different. And as well as that, the conversation around veganism is so ideological and so polarizing. That's just not helpful. So I think it's important to be non-judgmental, to be more accepting, to be less polarizing, not least because, you know, it's not hard to look at myself and think about all of the things I could be doing better. Which brings me to the fifth point, which is we are all a work in progress. There's so much about this book that's easy to pull apart. The data is well researched, but it is controversial, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm not in a position to really scrutinize it that much. As well as that, do we really know that food is the best thing to focus on? I mean, why not car or air travel, other things like green energy or the amount that we're consuming? Even with vegan diet, focusing on the vegan diet, it is problematic. I'm aware of that, and the common foods that are present in vegan diets are often not the most ethical foods. They can be expensive, they can be out of reach for many people. And most of all, a lot of people will say that individual action, like changing your diet, is just pointless because, you know, why bother when really the main organizations that are causing this are big, shadowy corporations that we can't possibly ever influence. But from reading this book, it makes me think that in a way, none of these things really matter because we need to find a way to get through this together. And what that means is a combination of top-down leadership and action for individuals. It means everybody doing everything they can. So I think we have a summary slide here, do we? Yeah. And these are the 5 things I took away from this. But there's so much more in this book. It's really rich and beautiful. I've only scratched the surface in terms of what I've been talking about here. This is a memoir as well. He goes into things about his life, his family, his relationships. And all of this is interwoven, like I say, with this discussion around climate crisis. It's a very heavy theme, but going away from the book, it does make me feel optimistic about the future, which is not easy. It's got a lot of poetic ways of reflecting on this in the book. So I'll leave you with just one of these, which goes like this. No one who isn't us is going to destroy Earth, and no one who isn't us is going to save it. The most hopeless conditions can inspire the most hopeful actions. We've found ways to restore life on Earth in the event of a total collapse because we have found ways to cause a total collapse of life on Earth. We are the floods and we are the ark. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dennis. Very cool. Smile for Dennis. I'm not sure where my microphone is. Thanks so much, Ella. I've got so many questions about that. It's very much in line with my ambitions to change my diet as well. So hopefully folks have got a few questions for Dennis, and just pop them in the chat. We'll pick them up later. We'll move swiftly on to our last speaker for today, and that is Katie Dennison. So Katie is an Irish immigrant who was lured to Edinburgh by the bright lights of the Fringe and never left. She currently works as a copywriter at Sunshine Communications, a Leith-based social media marketing agency, and as a Fringe Festival reviewer for BroadwayBaby.com. She's a volunteer at No Hate Network and Superpower Agency, and is founder of Bitching Bookworms. I'm intrigued by that little group, by the way, a Scottish-Irish book club. And today, Katie's going to share her insights from The Architecture of Happiness by Alain de Botton. Katie.
Thank you, Andy. Hopefully you can hear me all right.
Sure.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for that introduction. And the fact that I wrote it doesn't take away from how glowing it was. So I appreciate that. Really excited to be part of this today. Long-time listener, first-time caller sort of vibe. I've been watching these throughout lockdown, and it's just been something to really look forward to every month. So this book, which is called The Architecture of Happiness. I'm not sure if the slide is up. I can't see it on my screen, but maybe it's, oh, there it is. Good. Thanks, Sandy. So first off, just to be very clear, This is a book about architecture. It's not specifically about building a happier life. It's about buildings themselves. And so if you are confused by that, you're not the only one. That's what I also thought when I saw the cover of it. And that's kind of what intrigued me and led me to read this book. But it's actually about, about structures, about architecture itself. Oh, good, somebody likes the author, that's great. Also, just to clarify, I do not have any background in architecture. I'm not an architecture student. I didn't know anything about it until I started reading this book. So if you are someone who knows a lot about architecture, if you could just keep that to yourself until the end, maybe, just in terms of my confidence levels. Thanks so much. Just if we want to go into the summary slide. Great. So this book is a tour through the philosophy and psychology of architecture, aiming to change the way we think about our homes, streets, and ourselves, and asking that large and naive question, what is a beautiful building? Now, that being said, later in the book, the author does actually say that the question of what is a beautiful building is unanswerable and shouldn't be asked. So really a contradiction throughout. Also, the book is more of a collection of essays, so it doesn't have as necessarily a clear structure, kind of point A to B, but it's just a lot of interesting discussions about different types of architecture. And since I picked it up, which is about a month ago, I have been going on early morning walks before work for like an hour or two, exploring Edinburgh basically every day for the past 3 or 4 weeks, and haven't run out of things to look at yet because Edinburgh is such an incredible city. But also that just speaks to how interesting this book is and how it just completely opened my eyes to something that I hadn't really been aware of before. So again, obviously, I highly recommend it. So the first thing, also just to, I kind of want to apologize because I shoved in all these images to the slides and I was thinking all the designers out there would be like, that's the wrong placement. Why did you do that? Move that over to the right. So I apologize for that. But anyway, the first thing that I learned is that architecture is the type of artistic expression with the biggest impact on us. So I mean, the idea that architecture, is art seems obvious, but I guess it's just something I hadn't thought of before in terms of how we study other forms of art at school, like paintings and literature and poetry, and not architecture, even though it's the kind of art that we can't avoid and that impacts us whether we like it to or not, mostly in an unconscious or subconscious way. But you know, those of us who live in cities or in any kind of urban situation are just constantly surrounded by different types of buildings and don't have any way to analyze or, you know, look at that kind of art. And we also can react to architecture in the same way we react to art, where we might change our views on it over time based on our own life experiences. So you might look at a building when you're younger and think it's very beautiful, and then when you're older, have a much more poignant response to it based on the life experience you've had and loss you might have experienced or heartbreak. So it's kind of interesting in that level. Also, this author was talking about how sometimes people are a bit dismissive of design and kind of see it as an extra thing that we don't really need, or sort of materialistic in this idea that we can just spend money on these design things and they won't actually make us happy. But he argues that it's actually a very generous thing to add these extra flourishes to buildings and add these extra details, in that it reminds us that we're here not just to survive, but also to thrive, and kind of reinforces that message, which I really like. And he also says that because we are destroying natural beauty in order to like add man-made buildings, that we owe it to the beauty of nature to replace it with something that is worthy, which I just really like that idea. And that's just a few images of buildings in Edinburgh. The one on the right is Stuart's Melville College, which is just an incredible pauper palace that's now a school. And then the one on the left is the Scottish Parliament building, which is was quite controversial when it was built. And I'm trying to sort of teach myself to love it by learning more about the features and seeing kind of the aspects of it that maybe you don't really see when you just have the whole thing right in front of you. The second thing that I learned from this book is that buildings can speak to us and that we're vulnerable to the spaces we inhabit. So they speak to us in different ways. For one, from the angle of the architect themselves or the person who commissioned the architect to build it. Obviously, they have their own messages that they're putting into it and they have their own ideals. And then we also learn from it based on our own interpretation, and we can each be interpreting these buildings completely different ways, in the same way we do with any kind of art. So architects, in terms of how they're speaking, For example, modernists were trying to speak of the future, and they were trying to kind of erase the excesses of the past in terms of like classical and Gothic architecture that they saw as unnecessary. But religious architecture is really where you see how architects can affect people. And religious architects really understood that they could affect people with their buildings. And so they, when they were building these large cathedrals, and the image here is of Burgos Cathedral in Spain, which is absolutely stunning, and you could spend like 4 hours, and someone I know did spend 4 hours walking around it. So if you ever get the chance to go to Burgos, that's something to look at. But the idea of building these kinds of cathedrals was to literally cause people to sink down into onto their knees in subjugation, and to make them feel small and in awe. And because they realize that where you are can influence what you believe. And so even those of us who are atheists, when we're in a cathedral, might feel that extra sense of awe and that sense of spiritualism. And I know that I do. And so they just wanted to, impress upon people with certain ideas that might sound odd or unlikely in a different setting, that they would be more realistic or believable when you're in a cathedral amongst this kind of building. And also in terms of our vulnerability, that also reflects in how important it is for someone who's building a home for someone. They have just as much of a challenge to build a home as someone does to build a cathedral. Because a home is somewhere that we go to reconnect with our authentic self. That's what this author is saying anyway. That when we're out in the world, we have to perform so many different versions of ourselves that it's easy to lose sight of that authentic inner self. And that when we get home, that we can try and reconnect to that. And that's why we want our homes to like really reflect who we are and to remind us of remind other people of who we are. The third thing that I learned is that architectural styles go in and out of popularity based on what society feels it is lacking at the time. So when architects try to build something, and yes, I'm just speaking for all architects now, even though I already said that I have no background in that. When architects try to build something, they want to build something that is going to stand the test of time, something that future generations will love and appreciate just as much as our generation does, or past generations. Unfortunately, that search is ongoing because tastes change all the time. And everybody, different eras have different needs or different interests. And so, for example, the image that I have just on the screen there is of the New Club on Princess Street. And this was built in around the 1960s. And this is at a time when the Princess Street panel decided that they wanted Princess Street to have a more unified look, because at the moment it's got, every building is different. And it's been described as I think it was a cocktail salad or a fruit salad of architecture, because it's just like every different piece is different. Every building is different. And so they decided they wanted a unified front, and they wanted them to be in this style, which is sort of gray, concrete, very sort of industrial looking. And so at the time, they did actually knock down a few buildings and build the New Club and the building beside it in this same style. And they destroyed, beautiful Victorian buildings that were there before. Luckily, in the 80s, that idea changed again. And so the rest of the buildings were spared. But it just shows how quickly styles can go out of popularity. And it's also another thing that this author talks about is how societies throughout time kind of bounce between abstract art or appreciating abstract art and realistic art. And the abstract is more sort of orderly and geometry and symmetry and just kind of tranquil and, gives a kind of calm sense of purpose, while realistic is very vivid and depicts like real life situation and vibrant images. And so he claims that, well, actually, he was discussing somebody else's work, the name of who I have forgotten, so you're gonna have to buy the book. But he's talking about someone else's work who is arguing that societies throughout time will go for what they feel they're lacking. And so if a society is kind of having like frayed law and order or a bit of chaos or moral ambiguity, or is it a period of transition, that they will appreciate abstract art because they want that sense of order and tranquility. Whereas societies that already have strong law and order systems are living very kind of predictable and secure lives will look towards realistic art. And so, I mean, knowing this information doesn't really change anything, but it means that we might have more of an understanding of our reactions to art when we see it with kind of disgust. And that the idea of stylistic choice is that we see more of what that society was lacking rather than what they liked when we see their buildings. And if you just go on to the next slide, it's actually more pictures. This is just a really quick story that I am a big fan of. So you see on these slides, we have the classical art on the left and then the more Gothic style on the right. These are actually two sides of the same building. It's in County Down in Northern Ireland. And it was when a husband and wife, I think in the 1700s, although I don't know where my notes are on that, a husband and wife couldn't agree on which style they wanted to use. And so they just literally split the house in the middle, and the husband got the front, which seems unfair, but he probably had all the money. And then the wife got the back, and they just did it up in their own design. And it's the same inside as outside. It's got all the same features. And people apparently were absolutely appalled, but it is now my dream to go see this house because I just love that story. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what we call beautiful can change based on what we're exposed to. And I mean, maybe that's very obvious to you guys as well, but the idea behind this is one of the essays this author wrote, which was about the fact that we see our society's taste as sort of set in stone. We kind of see like, oh, we say sort of, you know, British and Irish people, we like this kind of design, but someone on the other side of the world in Japan likes this kind of design. And that's just the way it is. It's just the way our cultures are. You know, there's kind of nothing we can do with it. We're born with it. But the truth is that our sense of taste isn't really something we're born with. It's something that's guided by outside forces. And the artists in our country, you know, they saw certain things that they decided were beautiful, they portrayed them, and so they became the standard of beauty that we all accepted. And in the same way, in somewhere like Japan, things like cherry blossoms, which they're more exposed to, became a symbol of beauty and something that artists really focused on. And so we tend to stay silent about things that we think are beautiful if no one else is saying anything about it, because we don't want to be mocked. And so that means we just stay within these kind of bubbles until an artist starts to appreciate the thing that we like, and then we're kind of given permission to like it. And I think the example that he used was something to do with how like no one was really thinking about anything to do with, or no one was interested in London fog until a specific painter started like painting it really beautifully. And then it suddenly became like the beautiful London fog that we all appreciated and have always loved till the end of time. So that kind of thing. But the truth of the matter is like, these are just two basic kind of images of interiors. The one on the left is a Japanese interior, and the one on the right is kind of just a general, like what we would call probably a very nice British interior. And it's just the idea that like, those different tastes aren't set in stone. If we're open to change, we can appreciate other kinds of styles. And if we were exposed to Japanese style, like art like this, or an interior like this for a long period of time, we would also probably grow to appreciate and love it. So I guess just the idea is just not to jump to conclusions. If you see something and kind of think, oh, that's not for me, because it could be for you, you know, if you open yourself to it. And then the last thing that I have learned is just that architecture can't force us to behave well, but it can inspire us to access our best selves. So kind of throughout the book, there's this running theme about what impact architecture sort of has on us and what it can have on our moods. And the basic idea is that like in around kind of the 16th century and in this part of the world, people started to want houses that reflected their own ideals and values, that showed like the world who they were. Before that, there wasn't that same kind of strong sense of, you know, I want my house to look like me. And there are obviously a lot of beautiful examples of those manor houses around the country. Probably a lot of them were in the Pride and Prejudice adaptations, I'm sure. But the people who lived in those houses still made mistakes and still did bad things, and still had arguments and fights and showed the worst versions of themselves. So like we know that there are limitations to architecture in that it can't always improve us and it can't always improve our moods. But at the same time, we still want to live in beautiful settings because we know that we feel that gives us the best chance of happiness in life, and whether or not it's guaranteed. And the artists who built those beautiful manor houses knew that they weren't necessarily going to make the people inside them better, but they wanted to give them something to aspire to. They wanted to create something aspirational in the hopes that it might influence them for the better in some capacity. And so I guess the kind of ending of that is just that when people fail or fall down or act badly in beautiful settings, it doesn't stop us from wanting to keep striving towards those high ideals, and I don't think it should. And also, on a side note, maybe if they were acting badly in a beautiful house, they would have acted way worse in a bad house. So that's just something else to just think about. And so, yeah, I think we can just go to the summary slide, Andy, if that's all right. So, I mean, that's just obviously all the points we just went through, but I think the kind of general message of the book is sort of just to stay open to the art of architecture that's all around you. And I mean, because it's art, beauty can be anything you want it to be. So you don't have to be limited in that way. But maybe spend more time analyzing why you might love or hate a building, why you might have a strong reaction to something. And along those lines, let's all try to do that with the Scottish Parliament, because it cost about £400 million and it's not going anywhere. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was wonderful. I'm really up for just like, if you've got time today, just like an architectural tour of Edinburgh as well. That'd be great. Or like a TV show, anything. I definitely, I want more of that today, whilst like breathing deeply around the city and all those things. Well, a final round of applause for our 3 speakers today. That was absolutely wonderful. Again, my brain is fizzing with new ideas, and really want to pick up all 3 of those books and get them in my brain as quickly as possible. I was going to go back just to Dennis's book. Actually, there's a really interesting point you made about you know, it starts at breakfast. Sorry. Starts at breakfast, and as you say, it's probably like quite intimidating for folks to sort of have like a full behavioral change to adopt a vegan diet, but that was actually one of the first times I've heard like an actual like set of tactics to, you know, to change to change your habits. I don't know, is anyone else sort of like that you're aware of sort of approaching this behavior change?
No, I haven't heard of anybody. Maybe it should have been up to me to talk a bit more about that when I was reading the book. But it is a strong. I guess there's so much in the book. It's funny because that's the tagline there: "Saving the planet begins at breakfast." But it's just one of the many things in there, and he doesn't. To be honest, he doesn't go into it in super detail. It's not like you can imagine a whole self-help book could be built around this idea, but it's not like that at all. Maybe that could be the sequel. how to begin breakfast. But no, I haven't actually come across too many people looking into that, and I will speak more about it and try and get more people on board with that.
Yeah, it's like behavior change definitely sort of intrigues me genuinely.
You definitely have to take things a step at a time, don't you? And I think vegetarianism is often the gateway into it for people, but there are other options. There's pescatarianism. You know, maybe just, I know people who maybe eat meat at weekends and they eat plant-based during the week, so that's an idea too. Or things like veganuary as well. It's all good.
Yeah, sorry, I was just having a quick look through the chat for any distinct questions popping out. I think it's generally more around praise for everyone for sharing all that insight. But yeah, if I go back to you, Josie, as well, I'm supremely intrigued by your thoughts on breathe. And I was just wondering if that's, again, like looking at sort of behavior change or creating habits, has that sort of helped you create any distinct behavioral change in your life or created new habits?
Yeah, definitely. Since reading it, like I've just been so much more aware of my breathing than I even was before. Like someone mentioned in the chat that they started yoga over lockdown, which I think has been a good, it seems to be a popular hobby for people over lockdown. It's a good calming one. I really like yoga as well. I've been doing it for years. So I already thought about it a little bit. But like, as I said, because I didn't know exactly what was happening in my body, I was just like, oh, I'm breathing slow and I feel nice. Like, it's definitely made me think so much more about how I'm breathing. I think mainly in terms of slower on the regular, because like I only really would properly focus on breathing slower before, like when I was meditating or doing yoga. But I know when I'm out and about, like I'm not thinking about it at all, and I'm breathing like so fast, and I notice it because I end up like proper feeling like I can't breathe, and I'm like, why can't I breathe? And it's because I'm breathing far too fast. So yeah, like walking places I think has been the main one. When I walk, I try and intentionally breathe slower, even though it feels like I need more air. Yeah, breathing slower when I walk. It's a
Wondering
good
if
time to think about it.
wondering if we can combine Katie's city walks
Yeah.
with breathing as well.
Mindful breathing architecture walks, look and breathe.
Yeah, I was having like a nice soy latte
Mm.
and to move ourselves to a plant-based diet. And was there anything in particular that motivated you to pick up breathe? Was it like a sort of distinct problem or just like
Yeah, I mean, I notice like I shallow breathe a lot, as I said. So I think, I mean, when I just saw the title, it randomly came up on my Instagram. I think it was like a random suggested one, and like I like yeah, as I said, feel like I can't breathe an awful lot of the time, and I was just like, this is probably something I should pay more attention to. And it's always just something I've been interested in, but wanted to kind of challenge myself to the technical side. Because like I never really think about that, and it's always been very kind of scary, but it's actually not very scary. It's very interesting.
it
One
seems
thing
ridiculous. Sorry, on you go.
No, I was just going to say, someone asked in the chat, and I've just remembered if the book actually mentions the specific techniques like to do, and he mentions so many, so I didn't really have time to go into them. But for that, I really recommend the audiobook, which is what I listen to, because he has a colleague who he worked with, who's really lovely, who talks you through like the breathing exercises at the end. There's like a whole section for it, so you can practice them along with him. So I just wanted to say that's probably nicer to listen to it than read it for those.
Katie, I love that you picked up well, I'm assuming you picked up the architecture of happiness, maybe to learn about happiness.
Was I
shocked
trying to
find that
improve
it's
my
about
life?
architecture.
Yes, yeah, but I mean, I did look through it before I bought it, so I still did decide to buy it based on that. But I now have, I forgot to mention, after I bought this and got really into architecture and walking around Edinburgh, I now have bought not one, not two, but 4 books about Edinburgh buildings. So if you would like any information about any particular building, just send me a message and I will try find it in one of my many books.
As Emily pointed out earlier, you should follow Katie on Instagram for some early morning tours of Edinburgh. I'm going to this. But yeah, I love that it seems to, I mean, you stated you've not got a background in architecture by any means, but I love that it's really sort of, it's really motivated you to, find a lot more about architecture and appreciate it.
Absolutely. And I mean, it helps that we're in, that I'm in Edinburgh. Like, I don't know if, I just feel very lucky because there's just a wealth of options, to look around. And like I said, I've been exploring for a few weeks now and still there's loads more to explore. Although also I keep having to go further away and then I'm like running back to get to my laptop in time for work. So it's been a bit frantic.
Well, unfortunately, that is us we've run right out of time today, but I massively enjoyed that as always do. Hopefully everyone else did. And final round of applause for our 3 speakers today. Some super interesting thoughts, and always I feel so motivated to learn more about all these 3 things. So yeah, again, thanks to everyone for joining this morning, and hopefully you're motivated to pick up one of these books, or you just enjoyed today, and either of those is great. We will most hopefully be back next month, sort of mid-June, And yeah, we'll finish up there. So thanks again, folks, and hopefully catch you soon.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.